Well, first, maybe you might want to explain a little bit about our reason for being here, which is Abdul Kader, Emir Abdul Kader, who's a remarkable individual that many people don't know very much about.
Be happy to. Abdul Kader was in many ways a fundamentalist. He was a Sharia-loving, puritanical, not in a Taliban sense, which is a sort of deformation, but he was one who basically followed a puritanical form of Islam, which meant you follow the rules. You don't drink and you don't gamble, and you dress modestly and expect your women to, and so on and so forth. Yet he was also very curious about the rest of the world. He had an extraordinarily broad education. He was well traveled, and he had a kind of big tent Vatican II type of Islam, because he believed that God is greater. God is greater than whatever we think God can be, and none of us, no finite creature, can grasp the infinite, so we're all wrong. But none of us are infidels in all the ways relating to God. No creature worships him in its entirety. There's no error in this world except in a relative way. These are some of his thoughts which appealed to me. He studied Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Arab classics, Ibn Khaldun. He was trained in veterinary medicine, pharmacology. He was exposed to mathematics, astronomy, and he had a poetic side to him. So in a way he kind of represents, to me, a kind of a model Gulen-type education, in which he was bookended both by a strong grounding in his faith and the moral underpinnings of an Islamic Muslim way of life. Yet he was a brilliant student, and his father insisted that he get exposed to the so-called worldly subjects. You could divide his struggle into maybe three components of his life, or four even. The struggle to become well educated, which I think he succeeded quite well at. The struggle to lead a jihad, for which he had no education or preparation to do as a military leader. But by default, he became one. So he struggled with French occupation for 15 years. It involved both military struggle as well as diplomatic struggle and psychological struggle, struggling against an overwhelmingly powerful enemy in terms of his technology, firepower. And then he had 5 years of struggle with despair and betrayal in French prisons. And then he had the struggle of living in exile, living in a foreign country, even though they were Muslim countries, they were still not his home, and to adapt to living in exile. So he had a life of struggle that was full of disappointments, setbacks, and defeats. Yet throughout, he never allowed the demons of hatred and anger and the desire for revenge to control him. Jihad means holy exertion, to try to live a righteous life in war and peace, day by day. And to live a true jihad, you're always fighting to make compassion and mercy dominant over violence and hatred. In the first phase, his fame grew because he was this extraordinary military leader who had a natural aptitude, and he frustrated some of Napoleon's best generals for 15 years. So Timothy Davis, a lawyer from Utica, names a town in Iowa, which is still there today, Kader, a village. His partner said to him, well, what do we name this place? And they turned to him and he said, well, there's this Arab chieftain I've been reading about, and he admired from what he'd read about him. Let's name it after him. What did he admire about him? Well, he related to him because in 1846, you know, he was only 2 generations from our own struggle against British colonialism. We've sort of forgotten the times when we were subject to colonial powers. Why we can't today relate very well to it, because it's so distant in our past, and most of us don't even know our past anyway. But here, it was still a fresh memory what Americans had gone through, and he related to this Arab David fighting the French Goliath. And in addition to that, Abdul Kader had established a reputation of being a man of his word, a sort of a chivalrous fighter who treated his prisoners with remarkable concern, and later on in life, when he was in prison, his greatest fans and lobbyists and promoters were French soldiers who'd been his prisoners. So his popularity wasn't just among some elite literati. His popularity had actually sunken down to the masses. When he passed through Bordeaux on his way to Amboise, where he was held prisoner for most of the time he was in France, the people of Bordeaux were so impressed by his character and his graciousness and his manners that in the presidential election of 1849, the French presidential election of 1849, citizens of Bordeaux wrote him in as a write-in candidate for the presidency of France. He ended up in Damascus after passing through Boursa. And it was in Damascus that perhaps he reached his greatest level of world fame and recognition, and that occurred in the years following the Crimean War, 1854, 1855. The Druze went a little bit too far, and they started basically murdering the Christians in the Christian quarter. And Abdul Kader, seeing evil and knowing you're supposed to combat evil when you see it, went in with his men and started rescuing Christians, as well as the diplomatic community that included British, American, French, Russian, and turned his home, or his residence, which had formerly been a residence of Ibn Arabi, into essentially a refuge for the Christian and European diplomatic community. And when he had angry Druze and the rioters pounding on his door saying, "Give us the Christians, give us the Christians, you know, you killed Christians, why are you harboring the Christians?" Well, he came back with a very logical answer. He said, "You're a bunch of idiots. Don't you even know your own book? You act like beasts who only can react to water and grass, and don't you have any intelligence? The Christians I killed attacked my country. These Christians have done nothing. They are innocents. They are victims of lawlessness. You want to fight about it? I'm ready to fight." Well, the rioters disappeared pretty fast. As a result of that, he was hailed as a sort of great savior of the Christians. He wasn't the only Muslim to protect Christians, but he saved the most, and became known, again, his reputation sort of reblossomed as this great humanitarian, savior of the Christians. President Lincoln, Queen Victoria, Pope Pius, Emir Shamil, the Turkish Sultan, people from all walks of life, French Masons, send him letters of congratulations. New York Times writes an article about him. So he was a man of the hour. He cultivated virtue, and he cultivated it because of the way he had been instructed by his parents. His father catechized him in the 4 virtues. And interestingly, the 4 virtues are the same virtues that Christian monks catechized. Intellect, the ability to make distinctions, have good judgment, good memory, finesse in judgment, common sense, a whole set of intellectual qualities that help you make good decisions. Moral courage, the courage to direct or restrain your anger in the right way. Equity, fairness, treating people fairly. And finally, self-control. You can't treat people fairly and equitably if you can't control yourself. If you're envious, prideful, angry, how do you treat people fairly? He took it seriously enough that when he was fighting the French he insisted that his troops not mistreat French prisoners, even though it was long-standing, centuries-long custom to decapitate prisoners as you take on the battlefield, for the simple reason that you didn't want to feed and water prisoners in the desert. That's kind of ridiculous. And secondly, your share of the loot when you get back to camp is based on how many heads are hanging from your saddle. So you impose an impractical obligation on your men, and you rob them of their remuneration when you tell them they can't chop off the heads of prisoners. But the scriptures that he read, the hadiths in particular, required that he enforce that, and he did. Very unpopular, but he enforced it by a combination of carrots and sticks. He rewarded his men financially, and he punished them physically if they were ever reported as mistreating prisoners. So as a result, the French had a real problem on their hand. They couldn't let the word out that Abdul Kader was this great humanitarian. They were fighting a fanatic. They were fighting a nut, a brute, a savage. So what is a fanatic? What's the difference between a fanatic and a freedom fighter? To Timothy Davis, he was a freedom fighter. Fanatic is basically somebody who's fighting on behalf of a cause we don't understand or don't believe in. In this case, he was fighting on the behalf of his faith. Christians didn't fight in their faith anymore at that point. If you fight and believe, you're willing to die for your faith in our modern times, you're generally considered a fanatic. Whether you're living your faith well-guided or rightly guided or wrongly guided. But the French, basically considered these wild Arabs, fanatics, because here they were all hepped up on their religion. And they were ferocious on behalf of something that they didn't really relate to anymore. They related to the flag. If you relate to your flag and you're fanatical on behalf of your country, you're a patriot. But if you're fanatical on behalf of your religion, you're a fanatic. And I think that mentality pretty much carries through today.